Hi, so today I'm going to be demonstrating how to make a model view controller application using REST API and .NET Core with MySQL. So let's get started. First, we're going to want to create a new project, and we are going to want to make it an ASP.NET Core web application. Let's just name mine REST API example. Sure. You want to make sure you choose the API example or starter code because that's the one that gives you what you need to start with RESTful services. All right, so first thing we want to do is we want to create our object or model that we're using. So I like to make a models folder just to keep things nice and organized. And we're going to create our new model, and I'm just going to call mine item just for the sake of this test. You could call it whatever you want. You can make it any type of object you want, but for the sake of example, I'm just going to keep it pretty simple, and it's going to be an item class. So I'm going to do it with a public integer. Oh my gosh, public int, and this is going to be our ID. And then we can simplify how we type these things out by typing in prop and then tab. And then I'm going to make a string for colors. And then we are going to make an int for just some int number example. And we are going to make a double just for a double number example. Oops. All right, so that should be good for now. And now we have to make a repository or a folder that holds things that connect to our SQL database called repositories. And we start with our new folder. We can call it, I actually like to call it data because it's smaller and I don't know, it's just the way I like to do it. So we start with an interface, call it a class, an interface, and we are going to call it item repo. It is just pretty standard .NET syntax to start an interface with the letter I. So now we've got our interface. We'll see later that if I don't make this public, we're going to have some problems, but I just kind of want to exemplify what will happen if I don't. So let's leave it not public for now. Yeah, and so now we just add some functions to the interface. We want an IEnumerable of items, and it's not going to like that because it's in a different folder, so you can just do control period, and it'll give you this using REST API models that will import up here, and now it's all right with that. So this function, again, we're going to want it to be public. And this one we can call get all items. And then you don't actually implement anything since it's an interface. And then we want a public item. And we're going to call this one get item by ID. And this is going to take in an integer for the ID. Great, so we're done here for now. And we're going to make a fake repository that implements this for now, just to kind of show the direction we're going, and then we'll clean it all up later. But for now, we're going to make a class called mock item. Yeah, we can call it mock item repo, and it is going to implement my item repo, and it's not going to like that. So again, control period, and we can implement the interface, and you can see that these aren't really anything that we care to return. So what we're going to do for now, just because this is a mock repository, not the real one, we're just going to return some dummy examples. So we're going to do a return a new item, and then we're going to say ID is 1, color is blue, because I like blue. The hint number, let's go with 55, sure. Doesn't really matter. And the double number is just going to be 0.2. Why not? All right, and then similarly for this one, we need to return a new list. Return new list, and it's going to have, we can just put in some reusable data here. Hold on, we need to close that off. What do we got here? What did I do wrong? Just like this. Oh, I did something wrong. ID equals 2. Fix it in a second. Red, just change the values a little bit, just so we have some different values. ID equals 3. We'll make this one green. Let's go with 22, sure, and 0.9 is good. Oh, needs to be a list of items. There we go. So here we just got some fake data that we're generating just for the sake of example, just to see which way we're going. So now we're going to create the controller that basically will find what we're looking for based on what we input. We already have this controller class which came scaffolded in. We've got some classes here that we don't need, so I'll just get rid of them. It's just kind of examples put in so that you can learn by yourself, but we don't really need them for this example. But inside of the controller folder, we're going to create a new class. We're going to call it items controller. And that is going to implement a class called controller base, which our class doesn't know about yet, why we're getting the red squigglies, but if you do control period, then you can import the correct package. All right, so inside of here, or sorry, not inside of here yet, we're going to decorate this class with a couple things. First, we're going to make a route. So this is in the web address, the route that you use to get into the controller. What you can do is put something like this, controller, and that will make the route items, because the way this works is that it takes the word that comes before controller, but I like to just put it in as the word itself. Not really sure why, it just makes me more comfortable. And then we also need to decorate it with API controller. So a couple of things we need. First, we need to make use of our mock repository. So we're going to make a private read-only mock item repo, and it's not going to like that. So control period and import the right package. And we are going to call this underscore repository. And for now, it's just going to be a new mock item repository. Cool. And then we're going to make a few functions that we can use to get our data out. So first off, we're going to make our decoration for our first function, and it's going to look like this. It's going to be http get. And in this case, we don't need to add a new route because this is just going to use items, and you'll see what I mean later on when we're running through our tests. But this is just going to be public action result of. So the class we're making right now is the one where we get all of the items. So this is going to return an action result of I enumerables of items, or items. And we're going to need to do control period and import that class. We can just call it simply get all items. We don't need any variables for that. And it's a pretty simple function. The items they come from the repository, and if you remember from the function we made, get all items, it's just the repository, get all items. And then we just want to return OK and items. So this OK is our action result, and this is how we're going to view the items on our screen later on. You'll see. We'll be testing soon. And then slightly more complicated, but not really, we're going to make another function for our getting items by ID. So this one is going to need a specific route so that we can find the specified ID. And so the route is going to be like this. And I'll tell you what this means in a second once I type in. So we got our function, which is another action result. But since we're only returning one item this time, we don't need the I enumerable we have up here. We just need item. We can call it get item by ID, and it will take in an int. So this right here inside the brackets, when you put the brackets, it takes whatever variable is named the same inside of the function definition. So this will go in the web address, and again, you'll see what I mean in just a second. So now we just we try to see if the item is in the repository. Get item by ID. We want to make sure that the item exists. So if the item is not null, that means it does exist, and therefore we will just return OK, and then the item. However, if the item doesn't exist, then we just want to return not found. And one thing before we run this test, you want to notice that yes, this is get item by ID, but since we're just using this mock repository right now, and it's always returning the same item, this function isn't actually going to be returning any different thing no matter what we put in the web address, but this will be a good foundation for later on in the video. So next, let's pick up Postman. Postman is a free app that just lets you test your APIs. Everything in this video is free to get, and yeah. First, we need to run our application. I haven't opened the PowerShell yet, so this might take just a second. Okay, and to find this developer PowerShell, you can either search in the search bar up here, or you can do control, I believe it is an apostrophe, the key that is next to the number 1. Okay, so now I just need to change directories to get up to the correct folder, and now we can do the command .NET run, and we shouldn't get any errors, I hope. Cool, so it's running. Now if we go into Postman, okay, come on. You'll see if we do get, if I send it, here you can see all the colors that were hard-coded in, blue, red, green, and this is the web address I was talking about. So this is where you would put in your ID. So if you do 1, gives you blue, and again we hard-coded that in, so right now it doesn't matter. 2 should also give us blue. So it should some random huge number. It's all blue right now. But don't worry, we'll fix that later. So yeah, cool. So that's kind of the first part. We set up a mock repository, and now our item controller is connected there. So now we are going to do a little bit of dependency injection. So in our startup folder, in services, we're going to add a new service, and this service is, we are going to add a scoped and so the dependency injection that we're using here, excuse me, is that anytime we ask for item repo, which is our interface, we will get an implementation of our mock item repository. And again, we don't have these imported here yet, so control period, and we can import them in, and now those go away. Cool. So we can go back to items controller and just make things a little bit fancier. So we can make a constructor. We can do that down here. Make a constructor, and this there's a cool keyboard shortcut, ctor, oops. And if you do tab, boom, there you go. And so we want a case of an item repository in here, and we can just call it repository or repo. I'll just call it repo. Then we can make this, we can do this in here. I'll write it first, and then I'll show you something cool. So inside of here, we want to set our repository equal to repo. It's not going to like that because this says it is a type of mock item repo, and this is the interface. First, we need to get rid of that, of course. So what we do here is change this to item repo, and that will, because of what we did in startup, this will actually be a case of the mock item repo due to dependency injection. What do we got here? Oh, okay, so this is what I was talking about earlier. Inconsistent accessibility. Remember in the item repo, I said it has to be public. This is why it has to be public. Now that will be cleaned up. Oops, what did I just do? Just go back, yeah. Oh, no, just kidding. There we go. All right, so that's all set up now. And something cool we can do is, since it's such a short one-line function, we can just get rid of these brackets, make a cool little arrow, and that's the same exact thing. And I just think that looks a little cooler is all. It doesn't change how the code runs or anything like that. Next, we are going to want to add a few dependencies. So to do that, we're going to need to import or to manage our NuGet packages. NuGet is just a library, or is just a library of libraries, I guess would be a way to put it, or packages, and it's just a way to get in some new functionalities into your code. So to start off with, we're going to be, there are 3 different Microsoft Entity Framework packages we want to use. We want Entity Framework Core, and I am using 3.110 because I know that version works with another package that we're going to have to use to connect to MySQL. Maybe another one works now, but this is the one that I know for sure works. So we're going to install that. It's going to ask us a few questions. Okay, I totally trust Microsoft. Cool. Then we need another one, which is Entity Framework Core Relational. And same thing, we want them all to be the same version so that we know they work together. And then we want tools. Is that in here? There we go. Where'd you go? There you went. We're going to install that one. Accept. It's installing. And the last one we need for now, once this installs, there we go, we need a package called Pomelo Entity Framework Core.MySQL. It's that top one. And we can use the latest stable version of this because I know that that one works. Cool. And we're going to be installing a few more later, but we won't be installing any more right now. Yeah, and I'll just show you. This is where, if you double click on this part in your Solution Explorer, brings up this page, and this is where all the package imports that we just did come in. So you really don't even have to go into NuGet to make this work. You can just copy and paste these few lines in here, and it'll do the same thing. And it imports into over here in dependencies, packages. You can see all of them right here. Okay. Now we want to make sure that package is imported correctly. So in our developer PowerShell, oh, I forgot to end that. In our developer PowerShell, we're going to run the command .NET EF for Entity Framework, and you should see this little unicorn, which is kind of fun. And if you don't see that, then you can run the command .NET tool install -- global .NET EF, and that should install EF for you, or Entity Framework, but I don't need to do that since mine's already working. Cool, so now we're going to go back into, so I shrink this, we're going to go back into our data folder. We're going to make a new class. And this one is going to be our database context. So we are going to call it item context. This will be implementing DB context, which we are going to need to do a control period. And you'll see this is using one of our new packages that we just imported. Great. And now we're going to make a constructor. So ctord tab. And we are going to need something called DB context options. Just call it, well, it's going to need to use the class. And I'm just going to call it opt for options. Then we need this here, base options. Great. And we don't need to put anything in here for now. Then we need a public database set of items. So this is going to be the items in the database, and it's just going to be called items. And it is a regular variable, so we can get and set them. It's public. Great. And now, oh, sorry, we're going to need to do a control period. And now we're going to make our connection string. So go into, let me just close a few of these here to get us a little bit cleaner. Great. So we can open up appsettings.json, and we're going to make our connection string. So appsettings.json it's a JSON object, so we can just do a comma here and add another thing, and it's going to be called connection strings. So inside of here, this is where our connection string is going to go. I like to name mine the name of the class I'm using and then connection. So since the class here is item, I'll call it item connection. Great. Okay, and then we're going to need our actual connection string, and that I'll show you how to get. Oops, come on. Weird things. Okay, so if you open up MySQL Workbench, or at least I'm using MySQL Workbench, you should have a connection already. I have a connection. It's called mine. And so some of the things you'll need for your connection string. Here, I'll actually just type out the names first. So you'll need a server, which will equal something. You'll need a database, which will equal something. You will need a user ID, which will equal something. And you will need a password, which will equal something. And you will need, lastly, let's separate those to keep it clean. You'll need a port, which will equal something. So let's go into what these somethings are. So typically, if you're using a local database like this one, like I am, the name of the server is just going to be localhost. So like this, localhost. Great. In the database, I haven't made an actual database yet, but I'm going to want mine to be called items data or item database because that's what makes sense. My user ID, you can find it right here, right with next to the little person picture there. So mine user ID is root. And for the sake of this video and for just simplifying my not secure data, I have a very simple password, which is just the same as my user ID. So it's just root. But you can set them to whatever you want when you're defining your database. And for the most part, your database port is most likely 3306. But when I was setting up this database, or this connection, sorry, when I was setting up this connection, that port was busy on my computer, so I had to make a new one. And you can see it right here. These last four numbers, mine is 3307. So mine's just one off the regular, which isn't too bad. 3307. Cool, we can save that. And then we can go back into our startup. So we're going to add another service. In this one, we're going to be adding our context to our program. So to do that, we go services.add db context. Services.add db context, and then we use the name, which was item context. Great. Now we have some code that we need, which is the options where we want to use MySQL. It's not going to like that because we haven't imported the correct package yet. Now we have. It still doesn't like it because it needs stuff inside of these parentheses. So what it needs is configuration dot get connection string, and then oops, what did I just do? Okay, great. And we need a string here. Oh my gosh. And this string is coming from app settings JSON. It is just this string right here. Whatever you named your connection, that's the one you want. So we want item connection. Great. Now we're going to go over to item CS, and we're going to add a few decorations to these so that the database knows a few things about our variables. So first, for the ID, we want that to be our primary key. So we're going to name it key, or not name it, but we're going to decorate it with key. And then we do a control period, and we're going to be using this, this package. Cool. Now for color, we want all of these to be required. We don't want any null values, so we're going to make all of these required, and we can just copy and paste that over the numbers. And lastly, I don't want this, if you don't do anything about over strings, they'll be put in as long texts, which isn't a big deal, but it just takes up a little bit more space. So I'm going to make this a max length of 15 characters, which is plenty for a color. I don't know any colors longer than that. Okay, now we're going to do something called a migration, which is how we are going to move some the database context from our program to MySQL. So if we jump into MySQL, I already have one called items DB from previous, but you'll notice that I called this one item DB, I believe. Was that in context? Okay, well, I did call it item DB, but either way, we can just delete this table, drop schema, drop. So now it's gone. You see it's gone. Great. So now we're going to do something called a migration, like I said, which is how we're going to get our information over to the database. So we're going to type the command .NET entity framework, so EF, .NET EF, migrations, add, and then I like to name the first one initial migration, just kind of good practice. Initial migrations, sure. And then now keep an eye up here when I hit enter. There we go. Now you'll see this new folder, and here is our migration, and you'll see, so we have the name of our table, which is items. We are making a new table with an ID, which is not nullable. These are all nullable, or all not nullable, sorry. And our primary key is ID. Great. Now if we go into MySQL Workbench, there's still nothing there. So we have one more thing left to do, and that is to update to the database. Now to do that, it's just .NET EF, I believe. Yep. Then we do database update. All right, so we'll see. Okay, we should see now. Yep, there we go. So now we have our table. Items, there's not any data in it yet. Let me just make that full screen. You can see here, it doesn't have any data, but here are the columns we wanted. So, now let's just put in some dummy values just so that we can play with it later. So I like the color blue. Just choose some random values. Red, 34.8. Let's do yellow. Yellow doesn't get enough love. 22, why not? 0.1, sure. And you'll notice I didn't put anything in the ID. That's because they are going to auto-generate, and that is helpful because if they auto-generate, then there's no chance that they're going to overlap, which would cause problems because it's the primary key, and there can't be more than one of the same primary key. So if we apply that, hit apply, finish, and you'll see the ID auto-populated. And if we run this command again, it'll give us all that stuff. Great. That's perfect. So now we can go back to the data folder, and we are going to make a new repository that's going to take over place for the mock item repository, and it's going to use our actual SQL data. So it will be called, I like to call it SQL item repo. And again, it is going to implement our item repository. And we're going to need to do control period, implement the interface. Okay, and this is pretty simple actually. So all we need to do for this function, we will be returning. Oh, yeah, okay, returning. We're going to be returning context dot items dot to list, not context. Oh, and we're going to need, sorry, I forgot something here. We need to make a constructor and it is going to be taking in item context, and then we can do underscore context is equal to the context, and we haven't made this yet, so we can do control period, and we want the read-only field. Perfect, so that fixed this function, and again, I like to kind of just make this needlessly fancy. And you don't even need to put the word return in, and that works. So now we just need to make this slightly more complicated function. Not really though, it's still pretty simple. We're going to do context dot items dot first or default, and we're doing the first or default where for an object I. Nope, not ID. I dot ID. Not. Yep, there we go. Is equal to the ID that was put in. ID. Oh, we have to return it, but again, we can just make it a little fancier. Add the cool little arrow. There we go. And now we want to just make sure that nothing is broken, so we can do a .NET build just to make sure we get no errors, hopefully. Cool, no warnings or errors. Sweet. So now we want to go back and adjust the dependency injection that we made. So instead of the interface going to a mock item repository, we want it to be an SQL item repository. So that's good. Now, if we go back into the controller, I believe. So now this item repository is actually, unless we state otherwise, which we don't, is actually an SQL item repository. Great. So now let's see. Let's go to Postman. Or first, let's do a .NET run, so we can get our function or our program up and running, and we're going to need to open Postman. Cool. So now we should see our new data, hopefully. All right, blue, red, and you'll see, oh, go away. And you'll see that yellow is in there now. And hopefully, so this gives us blue, this gives us red. There we go. Now we're working. However, if we put in a value that isn't, it just says not found, and we're going to clean that up in just a minute. Cool. So we are going to go back to startup. Oh, actually, first we want to make sure this isn't running anymore, so that's a Control-C. So we're going to startup, and we're going to add a new another service, and this one is going to be called AutoMapper. So we need a services.add AutoMapper, services.add AutoMapper. Oh, I might not have imported this package yet. Okay, so we have a few more packages to import from NuGet before running this command. So I'm going to do this the other way I said, where instead of going in and importing each one individually, we can do just a copy paste. So that I have 3 new packages we're going to need for the rest of the video. I'll try to point out when we're using them, but I'm not going to make any guarantees. So the one that we need right now is this first one, AutoMapper extensions. This is going to be for dependency injection. We need one for a JSON patch, and we need one for Newton soft JSON. Oops. So if I hit save, we look in the dependencies. That was just loading. Now you can see the other ones are imported as well. So now we're back in startup, control period. Oh, come on. period. Might take a minute, not sure. Services dot. Okay, services dot add auto mapper. There we go. Oh, it only wasn't working because we didn't fill out the parentheses, of course. So we want app domain. Oops. We want app domain dot. We want the current domain. And we want to get the assemblies. Cool. So we want to make a new folder now called DTOs, and a DTO is a data transfer object. So this is how we are going to, using this, you could mask certain data that is in an item, or you could just basically you can choose which pieces of data users can see or which pieces of data they need to input to make certain objects, and I'll explain more as we're doing it. But so for now, we want a new folder. We're going to call it DTOs, or data transfer objects, and we're going to make our first DTO. So we want a new class, and this class is going to be called item read DTO. So inside of this class, we're going to make it very similar to our item class in general. In fact, I'm going to copy and paste it in. Excuse me. But we don't need the decorations for the read DTO. And for the sake of argument, so like I said, using these DTOs, you can mask certain variables, you can hide them, you can choose which ones the user see, basically. So for the sake of this example, I'm going to comment out double num, and you'll see later on when we are getting our items, we won't be able to see the double number. Great. Now we need another new folder, and this one is going to be called profiles. And profiles it's a pretty simple. A profile is a pretty simple class that just kind of tells which classes can be mapped to each one. So we're going to be using it, at least initially, to be mapping from an item to an item read DTO. And you'll see what I mean. Item profile. So this is, oops, not up there, down here. This is going to be implementing profiles, not profiles, right? Just profile. So we might need control period. Yep, and so that's using one of our new packages. Profile, so now we need a constructor, again, ctor, tab, and we are just creating a map between, that goes from an item, nope, not an item profile, an item to control period, so it stops complaining, to an item read DTO. Yeah. Great. And this is a function, so close it off. Okay, now we can go back to our items controller. And in the constructor, so I know how I made this. I know that I made it like this, but we don't actually want it to have that arrow anymore because it's no longer going to be a one-line function because we're adding a new variable, and this one is called imapper control period using automapper, and we're just going to call it map, or actually let's call it mapper, sure. And similar to this one, we are going to do an underscore mapper equals a mapper, and again we want it to be a read-only field. Great. So now instead of returning an item, we actually want to return item read DTOs. Let's start down here. It'll be a little less complicated. So instead of an action result of items, we want an action result of item read DTO, which again, we're going to have to import that function, or not that function, sorry, that folder. So now we're returning an item read DTO. This would actually run with a regular item, but that's not what we want, so we're going to change that. So we're going to change this to OK, and it will be mapper.map with a capital. And we, inside of these brackets here, it is an item read DTO, because that's the class that we want it to be. And then we put the item, which is just an original item, like this. Great. Now, similarly, we're going to want this to return an item read DTO, or an IEnumerable of item read DTOs. And again, instead of returning items, we're going to return mapper.map. Open a pointy bracket. IEnumerable of item read DTO. Let's see if I can get that out of there. Then we can close that, and then we just need to put items inside of the parentheses. Boom. Now, let's try it again on Postman. So, let's do a .NET run. I'll open up Postman. And again, I want to reiterate that it will not be showing the double number, because the double number is not included in the read DTO. So let's see if my theory works. So let's start with all of the items. So if we run that, now you'll see that the double number isn't there. Great, it's working just like we wanted. So we do 3, sure, great, everything's working as planned. So now we're going to implement some new functions. We are going to want a function that creates items now. So you can create an item from Postman. So first thing we need to do, let's close these up. Again, I'm just going to clean it all up again. We can just close all but this, sure. And then also close that. In data, we want iItem repository, and we're going to make 2 new classes. So we want one class that is a public void for creating an item, and that is going to take in an item. Cool. And then we want a public boolean that will save our changes. If we don't save our changes in our database after we put a new item in, or later on when we delete an item, then the database won't actually change. It'll have things happen, but then it'll just go back to the way it was. So we need to save changes. So great. Now I'm going to delete the mock item repo, because every time we do an update to iItem repo, we would need to implement new stuff, and we're not really using it anymore. It was more of just kind of an example for the beginning, so I'm going to delete it. But we will need to implement into SQL item repository. So if we do a control period, we can implement, excuse me, and here, item. It's a pretty simple function. So if the item doesn't exist, so if the item is null, then we just want to throw an exception. So we're going to throw a new argument null exception using the name of the item. Great. However, if not, then it's simple. We just want to do context.items.add item. And again, if we do nothing after this, the database would just go back to normal. It wouldn't actually add this item in. It wouldn't save. So what we have to do is we have to run our function save changes, which is this function right here, which we will implement right now. This is another pretty simple function. all it is we will return context dot save changes, same name as our function, greater than or equal to 0. Great. And this is another function that I'm just going to do it just for the heck of it, where you can make it a little fancier. Oh, you don't need the word return there anymore. Great. So now that we have that saved, we're going to make a new data transfer object. So in our data transfer objects folder, we are going to make a new class. And this one is item. We have item read DTO, so you guessed it, item create DTO. And it will be similar to the last one in that it will have, here, I'll run through it really quick. So, like we've talked about earlier in the video, the ID is actually auto-generated, so we don't want to allow users to add an ID. So all we really need is color, int number, and double number. And we want to make sure that these are required so that the system knows if the user didn't put in a color or if they didn't put in a number, they know that something is wrong and that it won't let it happen. And again, we want to make the color have the max length for the same reason as we did in the original class, so that it's not a long text. So control period, put those in there. Great. Now, back in items controller, we are going to make a new function. And so these ones are HTTP GET, so that's where you're reading in data, but now we're actually creating new data, and the decoration for that is HTTP post. So HTTP post means that you're creating a brand new entire row in your database, in your table. And there are different functions. There's get for reading, post for putting in an entire new piece of data, and then we'll go over the other ones a little later, but there's also put, oh gosh, I can't think of it off the top of my head. HTTP, there's put, which is updating an entire item in your database, patch, which is updating just a piece of an item in your database, and delete is another one which we're going to use, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just deleting an item in your database. So, what I do here? Oh, yeah, it's not HTTP create, it's a post. So we want a public, and this one is, we're going to do another action result. It'll be similar to this function in a way. So we're going to do, it's going to return an item read DTO so that you can see the item that you created. We're just going to call it create item, and this is actually going to take in an item create DTO. Sweet. And then we can do var item model. So this is going to be our actual item from the class itself, using all of the things. This will be our actual item, and that is going to be using a mapper. Yeah, we're going to be using a mapper. So we're going to do, mapper.map from, oh, I need to put an actual variable there, call it item create. So we need to map to an item using our item create. Okay, that was weird, not what I meant to do. Item create, great. So So that is all nice. You'll see that we actually are going to have to create this map in a second, but let's finish writing the function first. So we'll do a repository. So this is just going into our repository, and we'll run, and we'll run this function, create item. And we will use our item model. Great. Then we're going to make an item read DTO. I'll call it item read just to clarify. And that again is going to be from the mapper dot map to item read DTO. Not parentheses. We want the pointy brackets. And this will come from item model. Yes. Then we are going to return a created at route name of get item by ID and a new where ID equals item read dot ID, and we have our item read. Same thing. Great. So one other thing we need to do in this before we can actually make this map is in our HTTP GET for get item by ID, we need to add another piece inside of the parentheses, and that is going to be that the name equals, we can call it the same name as the function. So we can do name equals get item by ID. Sweet. Now we can make our map. So we go into, that is in our profile. So we're going to create a new map. So Control D just duplicates a line like I just did. It's pretty handy. So now we are going to be going from an item create DTO to an item. So that's how in the controller we are switching from this item create DTO to the model itself. So now we can check out Postman again. So let's, I left it running again. That's not good. That's all right, not a big deal. We can do .NET run. Shouldn't have any problems. So let's open up Postman. We can also check to make sure this starts. Are you starting? Yes, you are. Cool. While it loads up, so again, let's just make sure we're still working. And let's take a look at all the list here. So we have one, go away. We have 1, 2, 3. We have 3 items right now. So let's make a new item. So to do that, you go over here into body. Make sure you're in raw. Oh, that's for later. Don't worry about that. Raw, and it's in JSON. And you need to change this get or from get to post. And I have some pre-copied data, but I'll just type it in just to show. So this is just where you can put in a JSON object that'll be a new item. So we can do something with a color. Haven't used the color orange yet. We can do an int num. Make that, I don't know, 99. Sure, good number. Then we can do a double num. And something to notice here is that I put a 0 in front. And if I didn't put a 0 in front, it wouldn't like it. So you need to put that 0. So here, let's try it. Send. It says created. If we look in the headers, it shows the location. So if we go to this spot, get, let's see. Oh, not in there though, in body. There, see we got, oh, Why is our number 0? Something must have happened. Items. That's no good. Let's see if we can figure it out. Create item create DTO, required int number. Did I just name something wrong? Did I call it? Oh, let's see. I think I know what it is. Let's see. What do I have an item here? Int number. Okay, I called it int number for some reason. That was dumb, but now we're kind of in it. I should have called it int num because that's typically what I do, like for double num, but that's the problem we're having. So if I change this to int number, now we're going to kind of have a messed up database, but that's all right. We can post. We're going to need to, actually, I don't think we are going to need to rerun this. So if I post that, let's see. There we go. Now our int number is working. And if we do a get for this ID is number 5, there we go. ID 5 orange 99, and you can see in here we have 2 oranges now, but you know, this will be actually a decent thing we can change later in a future example here. So it's not a big deal, but that's all right. Great. Now I want to make sure I actually end it this time. About 50% on that so far. Cool. So now we can move on to a new API, and that is going to be in our iItem repo. I think I still have it open. Yep. We're going to do another function, and this one is going to be for updating. So we're going to do a public void update item. And this is going to be need an item in it. And this next part might seem a little weird, but we are going to first have to implement that interface, of course. And inside of this function, we're actually going to do absolutely nothing for now. The reason this is happening is because we're going to be updating our function actually in our controller, I believe, and not in this repository. But if we decide in the future that we want to implement it here, it's just kind of good practice to have this function ready for the future. So now we're going to go back into our data transfer object, and we're going to create a new data transfer object. And this is going to be item update DTO. And this is actually just going to be an exact copy of our item create DTO for now. It's still good practice to have it in here. Again, just in case you want to make changes in the future. So we could technically just use the item create DTO in this case instead of making a new one, but it's not really hard to make a new one, and it could help you in the future. Now we can go back to items controller. We're going to make another function here. So this one, where this one was HTTP post, which is putting an entire new object, we're going to do HTTP put, which is updating an object. And similar to getting an item by the ID, we are also going to be getting an item by the ID that we can update. So just got in our quotes, we put ID. So we want another public action result of nothing. We don't need it to actually have anything inside because we don't need to return anything in this case. So we're going to make the update item function, and it's going to have an ID, which we'll get from our web address. And then we need an item update DTO, which we'll get from the body in Postman, just like we did for item create, where you had to write it in JSON format. So item update, This is mad because we don't return anything yet, but we'll get there. So we can actually just copy this right here because it's doing the same thing. We want to make sure that an item with this ID exists, and if not, we want to tell them that that's not that it's not in there. So if item, oh shoot, did I do the wrong one? No. Weird. Okay, but we can actually just return, oh, not that, not found. Cool, and that is if it equals null. Great. Cool. So if it is null, we can just return not found. Elsewise, we can do a map from item update, this item right here, to item from repo. Which is, oh, sorry, this is, instead of item, this is the item from the repository. So this is a real item, just the class, and item update is our DTO. Cool. So this line is actually updating, this is the line that is updating our data. You'll notice that these ones are, usually when we're doing the map, we are mapping with these pointy brackets using this, which just maps the local variable. But in this case, we're actually updating the database directly using this item update and inserting it into the item from the repository. So we're just kind of doing a little switch with the items while keeping the same ID. So this updates the entire item. So if you have an item that's ID is 3, the color is orange, the number is 2, and the double number is 0.6. You could change every single one of those values. You could make it green with the number of 10, I don't know, I'm just making up numbers, and then a double number of 0.9, but it would still have the same ID, which I think I said 4, could be wrong, I don't know, I apologize. They'll have the same ID, but they could have completely different or similar values. And then we are going to run this function, which is repository update item, and we are going to use the item from the repository. And if you remember, this function, update item, it doesn't actually do anything, but again, it's good to call it here just in case you implement it in there later. Let's change that to and the last line, we just want to make sure that we save our changes. Cool, and then we just have to return something, so we can return something that is really nothing, no content. So if we get no content, that's good. And then now we just have to create our map. So back in profiles, we have another map, Control D, and this is item update DTO to item. Great, now we can run our program again, and hopefully it doesn't have any errors. Open up Postman. The reason I keep closing Postman is because I have a lot of things running on my computer right now, and yeah, I just kind of am trying to keep the load as low as I can. So we can look here, and I totally on purpose made this value that I don't really like. It has the same color as the fifth one, and the int number is 0, which is kind of lame. So let's update it. We can go into the body, similar to when we posted, and again, very similar to when we posted. We can just keep this same format. Let's call it, I like the color purple. What number haven't we used yet? 64. Sure, double number of 0.83, why not? And now we just have to change to put, and we want it to update the item that has the ID of 4. So we're just going to put 4 in the address, and let's see what happens. Great, so you see that this says no content. That's what we wanted. Now if we do a get, hopefully it gets purple. Sweet. We can check out all of them just to make sure. Yep, there we are, purple 64. Nice. Now we can go back to our startup. Actually, first let me stop running this program. There we go. Let's close a bunch of these. Close. Let's just close them all. Go to startup. Using. So I'm going to actually type in the using statement here so that it makes it a little easier in a minute. So we're going to do using Newtonsoft. That's one of our packages we imported from NuGet. So we got newtonsoft.json.serialization. That's it. So now we need a new service. Well, actually not a new service, but we're going to add to this add controller service. We're going to do add Newton JSON. And we're going to get a kind of weird looking function here. So we're going to first open it up like that. Then up here, we're going to do this interesting S pointing to. And then now we need brackets like that. We don't need that space, but we need brackets. And serializer settings, contract resolver is a new camel case property names contract resolver. Cool. So that's just something we need in this function to make the JSON with our camel case work correctly. If you don't know what camel case is, that's basically when you type a word where or not a word, but a variable or something like that where every word is capitalized. So you could, that's why it's something like camel. Oops, okay, so you'll see how this is capital, this is capital, this is capital, this is capital, this is capital. That's camel case. Great. So now we just need to make another map. So we're going to go to profiles. And this is kind of something important to note. So if you make this map here, item update DTO, it maps from the update DTO to item, but it's not necessarily the other way around. So what you need to do, if you want to map both directions, is you need to make another one that maps the opposite direction. Okay, now we're going to do a patch function. And this one we don't actually need to adjust the interface or any of our or any of the SQL repository. What we need is just an item controller. It's right there. And this one is called HTTP patch. So this is how you can update just very small portions. Like you can just update the color of something without putting in all the other data. And I'll show you how that's done in a minute. So again, we're going to need the ID of the item we are updating. Don't forget that. What's the problem here? Okay, I think it just wants something else here. So we want a public, and again, we don't actually need to return anything. Public action result. You can do a partial item update. And for that, we need an ID, which is coming from the web address. We need a JSON patch document, which is what we just did in startup. That's why we did. Nope, just kidding. I'm wrong. Totally wrong. It's something that we imported in REST API. Yep, it's one of these. Don't know why that needs to. Okay, let's close that one. So a JSON patch document, which we are going to need to import, control period, JSON patch. And then that will be with an item update DTO. And we're going to call that patch doc. Just that's the name of the patch document. So we can just copy and paste these lines right here because it's pretty boilerplate. It's just if the item doesn't exist, then we can exit out of it right now. But if the item doesn't exist, we have an item to patch, which we get by mapping to the item update DTO using our item from repository, which is just an actual item. What do we got here? Mapper.map item update DTO item from repo. System threading. Oh, yeah, that's why. Can't have that. We don't actually. This is just var, not, yeah. Dang, IntelliSense got me. Okay, doesn't matter. Here we go. We can do a patch doc. And we are going to apply to, we want the item to patch and model state. Great. Now, if we were having a problem, so if we can't validate the model in the item to patch, then we will return a validation problem. All right. Then we want to map our item to patch to the item in the repository. So again, just like we did in this function for updating the item up here, this is just taking the values in the item to patch, so the new smaller values that we have, and putting it into the item that's actually in our database. Okay, and then we're going to run this same update item. Again, remember this isn't actually doing anything right now. It's more just for good practice and in case in the future you want to actually use this function for updating. And then we need to save our changes. And lastly, just like the last function, we're going to return no content. Sweet. So let's open up Postman again, and let's run this bad boy. Make sure everything's working. You can do it. There you go. It's running. So let's just look at our things here. Yeah, I said before that yellow doesn't get any love. That's probably for good reason. It's kind of a lame color, so if I'm being honest. So let's patch it. Let's change it. So we can go into our body, and we actually need this time to make a list of JSON objects. So you could make multiple patches at the same time, but we're just going to do one right now. So first, let's make sure we have the right ID up here. That's 3. All right, so there are 3 things we need. We need the operation we're using. Oh, and it needs to be in a JSON object. We need the operation we're using. We need the path of that operation, which is the variable that we're changing. And then we need the value that we're changing it to. So we need the operation. which is just OP. And the operation in this case is to replace, because we're going to be replacing the color yellow. We need a path, oops, not patch, path. And for us, it is /color, since we're changing the color. And that's the name of the variable here. And then lastly, we need the value we are changing it to. Like I said, I like the color blue, so I'm going to make a variation of that. Let's use aqua. All right, now, fingers crossed, this should update that value. All right, no content, that's what we wanted. Now let's just get items 3. Perfect. It worked. Now there's no longer any more yellow. It is aqua. Cool. Now we're on to our final DTO and we're wrapping it up. So our last DTO is going to be to delete an object from our database. So we need a new function in our interface, which is in data, item repo. This one will be a public, a public void delete item, and that is going to take in an item. Perfect. So we're done with our item repository now. We're going to be done with our profile because we're not going to need any more mapping or anything for this case. And we are done with our startup. So let's go and implement the function we just made. So if we go back into our SQL item repo, we're going to need a control period, implement. Here we are in delete. So this is another fairly simple function. First of all, we need to make sure that the item exists. So if the item is null, then we are just going to throw an exception, which in this case, we need new argument null exception. Name of item. Excellent. Now all we have to do, context.items. So this context is our item context. So this is essentially our direct connection to the database. And all we do is context items dot remove item. And then we just have to save our changes, or else it won't stay, or else it won't stay removed. It'll come back. And since we're deleting, we're not actually making a new item or changing anything or seeing anything. We don't need to make a DTO in this case, so we can forget about that folder now. So let's go back to items controller for our final step. Let's make sure I'm on the right. Yep, okay. So here we are with HTTP delete, and we are going to be using the ID of the item we want to delete. So now we need a public action result, delete item. This needs an ID. So we can just do var item from the repository. So this is just the actual item we are taking from the repository, which is repository.get item by ID, and we can just use that ID. And we want to make sure that the item exists. So if item from repo is null, then we can return not found. Great. Now all we have to do, repository.delete item, and we can take that item that is in the repository. Then we can save our changes. I actually don't think I have that written in my notes, but I don't. Since we saved the changes here, we actually don't need to save the changes in delete item, which is nice. So all we have to do is return no content. Great. Now let's just make sure it's all working, and look at me forgetting to exit first again. That's all right. Let's run it. Open up Postman. There are loads. Okay, so let's look at our items. Let's get rid of, we don't need 2 types of blue in here. We can get rid of aqua. So let's get rid of aqua. So let's first 3 get it. Okay, so there it is. Now we change from here, we change to delete. Send it. No content, that's what we wanted. Now let's get, and it's gone. Great, so it worked. If you type in 3, it's not found, don't know where it is, because it doesn't exist. So perfect, that is how you can make a simple REST API in .NET Core using MySQL. I know I went through this pretty quickly. For a more in-depth look, I would recommend looking up Les Jackson on YouTube. He does a really good tutorial. He doesn't use MySQL, but if you combined what I did here with what he does, then I think you'll find that you can learn this stuff pretty nice. And yeah, thanks for watching, and have a good time coding.